Vera Menchik was the first women's world chess champion. And today I want to tell you a little bit about her story and also show off two of her fantastic chess games. What prompted me to share the story with you is this tweet by Emil Sutovsky, who is the FIDE president. FIDE stages the women's candidates in Monaco. Best female players, high stakes event, amazing venue, professional broadcast. Very few spectators compared to any top event with men. Where all who cared about women in sports and chess in particular. How we fix it, and deeds and not words. I can't tell if he's genuinely asking for help or if he's just complaining. Either way, part of the solution is that we change the culture and perspective around women's chess. Content creators, chess players, chess supporters, chess organizers, everyone involved has to play a role. So here's my part trying to educate everyone on the first women's world champion. As a pioneer in women's chess, Vera Menchik met a lot of resistance. Of course, she was the best women's player. So how did she get better? She had to play against men in all these other tournaments. And when she started getting included in some of the top chess events, some people had a lot of criticism. Albert Becker said that anyone that loses to Vera Menchik should have a lifetime membership to the Vera Menchik Club. In a strike of beautiful poetic justice, Albert Becker was the first person instated into the Vera Menchik Club. So let's see how that game went. d4, d5, knight f3, and just normal moves. c4, attacking the center. And black declines to take it, and we move into a scenario where black has put a knight forward on e4, and f5 is trying to reinforce it with pawns. White also does the same. Says, hey, I will jump in, and at one point, also lock my knight in the center. But black can trade it off. They do. She takes back with a d-pawn, and white takes the knight, but this time takes with the bishop. And you might be thinking, why would you take a knight for a bishop? Well, it's okay to give out the bishop pair because it's a really close position. So when it's a close position and the center's locked, knights are typically better than bishops. So Vera Menchik knows that, and she's not worried. She has a +1 position. Queen b3. The queens go over to the queen side. Albert doesn't want to give up the dark squared bishop yet, but now he allows the trade to happen. Okay. Couple moves later, and Vera Menchik suddenly has a passed e-pawn. And when the offer is presented to trade queens, Vera Menchik gladly accepts. Why? She's the only color with a passed pawn, and at the same time, the c-pawn could be weak. And a few moves later, you'll see how she makes that argument, because b4 immediately changes this potential weakness into an actual weakness. This pawn is now a backwards pawn. Shout out to woman grandmaster Dina Belankaya for clearing up any shadow of a doubt of what a backwards pawn is. One, it needs to be unable to be supported by its adjacent pawns, so the B and D pawns are already past the two squares where it could support the pawn. Two, it needs to be on a semi-open file. And here you can see that white has no C pawn, so it's a little bit easier for white to put rooks on this file and attack the pawn. And three, last but not least, it should not be able to move forward. And in this case, it can't move forward because of the b4 pawn. So we have all three criteria met for a backwards pawn. So how does Vera actually take advantage of this? Well, she starts piling up pressure on the c file, put both rooks here, and then she jumps her knight forward. And look at this. Everything in black's position is paralyzed. And she comes up with this dynamite move, knight b5. Look at this. A nasty pin, because you cannot take, you will lose the rooks. For example, take, and what happened? You are up in exchange because you lost a knight in exchange for a rook. And at the same time, you do have to move this rook because it's being attacked. So you can't take the knight, so you have to deal with the threat. You have to move the rook over here, but that allows Vera to start activating her king. Okay, a couple moves later, a6, trying to boot the knight out. The knight moves away. And then, as the rook reinforces this pawn, Vera Menchik continues to make progress with the king. And a couple moves later, a5. Whenever a pawn is pushed, you always have to ask yourself, what changed in the position? Because with pawn breaks, there could be a discovery, there could be a concession of a key square. And in this case, what square was this pawn covering on a6? That's right. After you take, knight b5 again, and this time you can't push the a pawn to kick the knight. So all of the same issues arise. You cannot take this knight because you will lose this rook. Rook d7, And guess what? Giant fork, GG, because you're going to move this king and, lose your rook, GG. Vera Menchik forks Albert Becker and puts him into the Vera Menchik club. Now that we've talked about that poetic justice, let's be real. You probably have no idea who Albert Becker is. But if you've been in the chess scene for a while, you might have heard of the former world champion Max Euwe. And yes, he is another member of the Vera Menchik club. They played before he was world champion, so let's see what happened between Vera Menchik and the future world champion at the time. d4, d5, c4, immediately hit in the center. And you see that a lot of times black will take this pawn, giving up some space in the center, but eventually, instead of trying to hold on to that pawn, oftentimes black will just allow it to be captured back. And black here gets a knight to b5, and they have very strong control over these light squares between these two pieces. So instead of running into any sort of forks, Vera just decides to castle. And after a few more moves, we get his check. The king does a delayed bomb cloud, and this is where the spice begins. e4. Bishop is getting booted. Goes back to g6. After takes. What's the best move here? Of course, you grab your fork and you fork him on e5. But black has one defensive resource. They take on d4. But you can still take and, hey, like you take with tempo and then you save your knight. Or you can play rook d1. If black takes, then rook takes d6. And this is totally catastrophic. You traded this knight for the bishop. And you're also still got two pieces hanging. And if you're wondering, okay, why not just queen c8 and then takes, like the rook would be hanging, right? But this is actually mate in 4. After bishop f4 check, you have to go king c5. And then, check, and pawn mate. Beautiful. So instead of all that, of course, black sees this, so they don't take the knight. They back up the bishop, try and save at least that one piece. But now, e takes f6. White is just up material, right? She's up a bishop for 2 pawns. Pretty good if you ask me. And here is where things get even crazier. She's like, oh, yeah, you're attacking my bishop? No worries. I'll just play bishop e3. I will leave that hanging. And what's the idea here? You take, and all of a sudden take, and you're really getting worried about discoveries on the queen. Pass the tempo back. You could easily do something like this, and you are losing your queen, and white would be quite happy. Again, black does not take either of the bishops. Instead, they protect that d pawn. So now Vera saves her bishop, and the king starts rerouting to the king side. And you'll notice that all these moves happen, like, this queen hasn't moved. It's still pinned, right? But if you move the queen, then you would have lost a pawn. But now that the bishop's moved, e5 comes. And look at this. This is ridiculous. Like, you think Gotham chess knew about danger levels? Vera Menchik was doing this since before Gotham was born. Literally. So the rook moves back, and then the bishop moves back. Now, a few moves later, we get a little more shuffling, and Vera Menchik decides to accept the queen trade offer. She's still up a piece for 2 pawns, and doesn't mind going to an endgame. So we continue forward. She rearts her pieces, and again, Max Euwe offers to trade down pieces even more. So as you trade material down, pawns get stronger, but that's not always true if you're just down material in general. So how does Vera Menchik take this game forward? She brings her king, takes a pawn, they exchange pawns this way, and now Max Euwe starts pushing the a pawn. And by pushing this a pawn, he's trying to shove this a pawn down the a file and somehow promote or win material, right? But Vera Menchik is like, no, I'm fine. I'm just going to walk my king over very casually. And when you get to a3, you're not actually putting any pressure here. I'm going to play b4. Savage move. She walked her king over to protect this bishop so that she could play b4 in a timely manner. And what's the idea here? Well, if you look at it, this rook has how many squares to go to? This rook covers the a1 square and the c2 square. And the b2 square covered by the knight. So this rook is basically trapped. What do you need to do to actually trap it? You bring the bishop in, and it's gone. So of course, in a desperado, rook takes d2. But now, not only is Max Euwe down a piece for 2 pawns, well, now he's just down a full rook because he just sacked another exchange. And Vera Menchik, it looks a little bit dangerous because you have a pass A pawn and a pass F pawn for black. How do you deal with it? Well, she deals with it by moving forward, not backwards. And after she drops another pawn, she takes one back, gives a check, wins the F pawn. So now it's just the A pawn that's a big issue. She doesn't even care. She's literally just like, I'll just drop every pawn and have my H pawn here, right? And it's not as big of a deal because she's up material, right? She gives a check, and she starts coming in for the king hunt. And it's really tricky because black is starting to run out of moves. You go to king h4, and then you drop another pawn. And after knight c3, a very calm king d3, and black resigns. Is there a super duper concrete reason why resignation is now? Not necessarily. I mean, it's definitely losing, but it just seems like Max Euwe just did not want to play on. One way this could have continued is, you know, a2, trying to get all the way to the end. Rook g4 check, supported by the knight. King up, another check. Nice little reroute to target the pawn. And if you promote, guess what? Rook g6, king h5, and then rook g1. And this is a discovered check. You can't block it. You're going to lose your promoted queen. And there's a ton of different ways to do it, but either way, this is how Vera Menchik defeated the future world champion Max Euwe. Big shout out to Jen Shahade for writing this book, Chess Queen. This is where I learned about Vera Menchik. And for those of you who want to support women's chess, just make it part of the culture. If you want to learn more, I have plenty of content, both short form, and I'm working on more long form content to show off women chess players' games and just talents in general. So do what you can to support, keep the conversation alive, and happy learning, everyone.